Okay, everyone, good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to the Rochester Public Library Local History and Genealogy Division's Rochester Rich History Series. I'm Christine Radarski. I'm your Rochester City historian and the manager of the Local History and Genealogy Division at the Central Library. We are delighted to have with us today Justin Murphy. Justin covers education in the Rochester area for the Democrat and Chronicle. He has an emphasis on the Rochester City School District. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Justin's work. He has worked at the Democrat and Chronicle since 2012, and before that was a reporter for The Citizen in Auburn, New York. He grew up in Penfield and attended the University of Chicago and the SI Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. And Justin recently published an article in the Rochester History Journal that the library publishes. The article is called Racial Segregation in Rochester Schools, 1818 to 1856, which is also the title of his presentation today. And this is part of a longer book length history that Justin is working on school segregation in Rochester. And so we look forward to seeing that book when it's available. Justin, thank you for being with us today. We're delighted to have you.
Thanks, Christine. Thank you, everybody, for coming on one of our rare, nice days so far. Just before I get started, I want to say, first of all, it's really a thrill for me to have a journal article in Rochester history. I couldn't even begin to count the number of times that I've gone to that for information, either at the newspaper or in my own research. It's such an incredible repository of information about local history. I'm really proud to be in that. And I also want to acknowledge that every single piece of information that I'm going to share today, Christine and Brandon and their team has physically carried to me or away from me, either getting things out of the archives or putting my microfilm back or something. There have been weeks that I've spent more time with them than my own family, actually. And I'm extremely appreciative of the help that they've given me. So I want to say thank you for that. Let me get my, oh, wait a second. I'll get my slide going here. I'll share my screen, sorry. Does that look right to everybody? I guess you're all muted. I'll just assume it does.
Good.
Good. All right. Good. So here's my history. A couple things. So my more general research has to do with the entire scope of desegregation and segregation in Rochester area schools from 1818 until the present, and probably the future too. But this period up until 1856, when the city schools are desegregated, is really both important on its own, of course, and indicative of a few other things. So just a couple themes that I want to start with. Maybe the most important thing is that a lot of the work that went toward making schools more equitable to Black families in the 19th century, whether to allow them to have a school in the first place or then to desegregate it. That work was done by parents for the most part, and of course we don't usually get their names from the news coverage, but there's a lot of places where you can see that happening. So for instance, in 1845, the school board was struggling with the question of whether to admit Black children and also what their tax obligations should be. So they passed a law, and it says Black parents are exempt from school taxes, and also their children cannot attend common schools except with the consent of the Board of Education. And so think that they felt that they had kind of settled the matter like that. But then the next year, a woman named Phoebe Ray, who in the city directories is identified as a domestic servant, a washerwoman, comes to a school board meeting and petitions for her child to be able to attend school 11, which is on Chestnut Street. So she takes them up on their offer to get the consent of the Board of Education. That must have been a very daunting thing for her to go in front of the city fathers like that. Her petition gets referred to committee and it never comes up again. But there's a lot of instances like that that we hear about. And also in particular, not just parents, not just Black parents, but women. We're going to hear throughout about not just Rosetta and Anna Murray Douglas, but Celestia Bloss, Myrtilla Minor, Lucy Coleman. There are a number of women who are going to come up. So those are two important things. Here's a piece of context that I want everybody to keep in mind. So we're talking about this area here, and you'll notice that there's not a lot of orange, which is our African-American population in the city. Throughout the entire 19th century, and in fact, well into the 20th century, the Black population of Rochester is absolutely minute. So in 1850, there were 550 Black people, and that's 1.5% of the population. And even by 1950, it's still only 2%. So for this whole time, it's usually under 1%, but it nonetheless, this point of desegregating the schools is in the news a lot. It's a major point of contention in the city for more than 20 years. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, of course, at the same time, you have the national abolition movement. So that is kind of making it salient and uncomfortable for people. And second, whenever Frederick Douglass lends his voice to something that is tends to get news, of course. So that's one piece of context. Another thing that I want to mention that's going to become relevant here is that the idea of a public school, and in fact, any kind of school, was very different then, of course. We're used to like very neat divisions between public schools and private schools and religious schools. And that just didn't exist at the time. The Rochester School Board itself was not established until 1841. So then, like in 1846, for example, we're going to see they vote to open up a Black school on Washington Street. So that's a public school that they've decided to open. But at the very same moment, they say that it will run while funds last. And of course, those funds didn't last very long. It was relying almost entirely on donations, and it dried up pretty quickly. So it's really a wide open system. If you're a wealthy white male, you might go to a private academy and learn Greek and trigonometry. Girls are often going to go to a finishing school. So that's what we'll hear about with Rosetta Douglass. She attempted to go to Steward Seminary. And so like that's probably the most prestigious school for girls in the city at the time. And instead of biology, they taught flower arranging, piano, etiquette, French, things that are supposed to make women marriageable as opposed to entering the workforce, of course. And then even in, kind of the proto-public schools, which are called common schools, there's no high school in Rochester until 1857. So for people who are not entering into any of these schools, which includes for a long time Black children, they rely on Sunday schools, which we don't now think of as part of the formal educational apparatus, but at that time, that was kind of the catch-all for, at the minimum, learning how to read and write, ideally reading the Bible. And it was also seen as kind of a means of control for the hoi polloi, the Erie Canal laborers. If they're inculcated at Sunday school, the kind of more enlightened portion of society is hoping that they'll be more malleable in whatever sense. So relatively few people in higher education. Access to education is strictly limited and very much differentiated. And that's our our setting to start off. So here's our first hero of the story, Austin Steward. Probably most of you know him, the first prominent Black resident of Rochester. He was brought up from the South by William Helm, who was a slave owner, a fairly wealthy guy until he gambled all of his money away. Came up first to Sodus Bay with William Helm, and then, so this is in about 1816, 1817. New York State has already abolished slavery in 1799, but there's like a series of provisions that it doesn't fully grandfather out until 1827. One of the provisions is that you can bring an enslaved people into New York State, but you're not allowed to then lease them out to somebody else. William Helm does not realize that. He attempts to lease Austin Steward out to somebody. Austin Steward then goes to Quaker abolitionists in Farmington, finds out that he can now be emancipated under the law, and he declares himself emancipated. The very first thing that he does is go to a bookstore and get some school books to undertake some kind of education on his own. So in 1817, he moves to Rochester. He opens a meat market on West Main Street. And that kind of becomes the hub for the Black community for a little while. And the following year in 1818, he opens the first Sunday school for Black children. This is all from his memoir. And here's what he says about the school. For a while, it was well attended, and I hoped to be able to benefit in some measure the poor and despised colored children. But the parents interested themselves very little in the undertaking, and it shortly came to naught. So strong was the prejudice then existing against the colored people that very few of the Negroes seemed to have any courage or ambition to rise from the abject degradation in which the estimation of the white man had placed them. So you can already see the debate that carries on to the present regarding, do we have lazy parents who don't care about education, or is it a part of a wider system of oppression? That is the fate of his very first attempt at education for Black children. That's in 1818. So that school closes, but he continues on in some fashion for several years, ends up teaching at another school. And one of his pupils is another person like him, freed from slavery, the Reverend Thomas James, who escaped from slavery in Canajoharie in 1819 and comes to Rochester in 1823. Like Austin Steward, the first thing he does is tries to obtain some sort of education. Thomas James is a really interesting character, not only in his own right, but he kind of provides a bridge from Austin Steward, who was his teacher, to then, after leaving Rochester a little bit later on, James moves to Syracuse and then to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he meets Frederick Douglass, who was living there at the time. And that meeting and James talking about Rochester is one among several of the things that brought Frederick Douglass to Rochester. So in 1828, Thomas James opens a children's school on Favor Street, which is in the 3rd Ward. And a few years later, starts AME Zion Church at the same site. It's a very informal school. We're talking about basically Sunday school in the same way. So this takes us up to about 1830, 1832. There's a couple of Sunday schools. These prominent people, from our eyes at least, because they're the ones who wrote memoirs, but still nothing in the public system, which is kind of still being created.
Justin, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but we're going to switch the interpreters now. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, go right ahead.
Thank you. So the first that we get into the public education system is 1832, and 32 parents in Rochester write a petition to the state legislature. And now remember, with the size of the Black community, 32 parents is a not insignificant number of people. And they write, the fact is too notorious that our children are despised, called Negroes, and completely discouraged by the white children. We do humbly believe that if the prayer of our petitions be granted, our children might be encouraged to learn, and although they are black, they may be made comely members of society, and we, their parents, would forever feel ourselves under the most solemn obligation. So an interesting thing about that statement is that it seems to imply that black children are already in class with white children where they're being despised and called Negroes and completely discouraged. And that's sort of an interesting thing that is going to come up again and again as we go through here. While we're talking about, and while the school board is talking about the official policy and what rules are on the books, in fact, there's a lot of children who enroll in the common schools, and increasingly over the years. Again, since the sizes are so small, I think that it was probably easier to make dispensations and kind of not make a thing about it. So that's going to come up several times as we keep going. So the legislature agrees. The petition had been supported by some of the leading white residents of Rochester as well. And this school opens in 1833. So again, we have the question of public support. There was a building on Spring Street, also this is all in the 3rd Ward, rented by private donors. The teacher's salary was paid by donors. And the following year, 1834, it closes because the black parents couldn't afford their portion of the salary. So that's 1834 up until 1842, 8 years, there's no public black school at all. So there's a couple of reasons why that might have fallen off the radar like it did. The city was incorporated in 1834. City council takes control over the schools at that point. So they, of course, had a lot of other things going on. It may not have been a priority. The other thing happening then, Austin Steward has left town by this point. Thomas James has left town by this point, and Frederick Douglass is not in town yet. So it could be, and this is a conjecture since the documentation is limited, of course, but it could be that there's no strong leader who's rallying the parents and leading the charge for public education for black children. So we're back at any rate to the situation in the 1820s where you have Sunday schools essentially for the black children. We get going again. 1841, a black parent complains about taxes. He says, as I mentioned earlier, why should I pay taxes for schools that my children can't go to? The city says, oh, geez, that's a good question. And they refer it to the state education commissioner. And he says, yes, it's true that the city has to educate these black children somehow. However, you have discretion over certain classes of people. It says persons having infected diseases, people with disabilities, infants, people over 21 years old. And he says, quote, the admission of colored children is in many places so odious that whites will not attend. In such cases, the trustees would be justified in excluding them and furnishing them a separate room. So the school board accepts that advice. And now for the first time in Rochester history, there's a formal law on the books for segregated schools. And from this point on, from 1841 until 1857, there is a continuously running black school. It gets shuffled around various places in the city based essentially on where the cheapest rent is available. It's on Washington Street, Spring Street. For 1 year, there was an East Side school behind the current Sibley building, but it was poorly attended. So as they move it around and as they continue to debate what is going to happen with it, the real concern from the perspective of the school board and the white community is not the educational experience of the children, but how much it's costing them to provide it. Again and again over the years, the school board calculates the cost and recognizes that it's spending 3 times or 4 times or 5 times as much per pupil for black children by running a school with just a couple of kids in it when it would be much easier to disperse them throughout the system. So they're sort of stuck in between the prejudice of not allowing the black kids into the school and the fact that it's costing them a ton of money. So for instance, in 1849, they have a committee on the question, and they say, if then, as we trust, we have shown that the system of exclusive schools for colored children cannot be maintained upon the grounds of economy nor utility, upon what ground then was the system first established, and why has it been maintained? We answer, it was first conceived and has been maintained solely in order to gratify a morbid public sentiment against the colored race. The committee makes that conclusion. Still, the school board doesn't vote to close the black school. There's politics behind all of that I'm not qualified to get into. Frederick Douglass says it's the pro-slavery Irish faction of the school board. I don't have any idea who that would be exactly, but they can't get over this hump of what to do with the black school. So now we get into kind of our significant turning point, possibly. This is Rosetta Douglass as an adult. That's Frederick Douglass's daughter. And shortly after he comes to Rochester in 1848, he needs a school for Rosetta Douglass, who, while they had been living elsewhere, was tutored privately in Albany. He decides upon the Seward Seminary. It's right by his house on Alexander Street, and it's essentially the best option for girls in the city at the time. So he sends her there. He's out of town when school starts, and he comes back and asks her how school's going, and she said, well, not so great, actually. When she arrived, the teacher said that she wasn't allowed to sit in the classroom with the white children. She puts her in a closet, essentially off to the side, to sit by herself, and every now and then the teacher will come over and kind of share the lesson with her. That you can imagine how well that goes over. So Frederick Douglass comes to talk with the teacher, a woman named Miss Tracy, and she says, well, my hands are sort of tied because I don't want to anger the school trustees because they pay for the thing essentially. But she says, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll ask all the children if they mind having her, and if they all say they don't mind, then she can stay. So she goes back, asks the children, and the children all say, yeah, she can stay, that's great. And Miss Tracy says, well, where will she sit then? And they all say, she can sit by me, she can sit by me. So she thinks, okay, that didn't work. So now she goes back to Frederick Douglass and Anna Murray Douglass, his wife, and says, well, I need to ask all the parents. And if any of the parents object, she has to go. And one parent, a single parent, did object. His name was Horatio Gates Warner. He was the publisher of the Daily Advertiser newspaper at the time. And the reason that we know this story in such a level of detail is that this is when Frederick Douglass had the North Star, and he wrote an open letter to Horatio Gates Warner laying out the entire thing. And this letter, this article he published essentially afterward went out to newspapers across the country, thoroughly exposing what I'm sure Mr. Warner had hoped would be a private matter on his part. And he concludes the letter to Horatio Gates Warner. He lays out this entire story, and he says, now I should like to know how much better you are than me, and how much better your children than mine. We are both worms of the dust, and our children like us. We differ in color, it is true, and not much in that respect. But who is to decide which color is most pleasing to God or most honorable among men? But I do not wish to waste words or argument on one whom I take to be as destitute of honorable feeling as he has shown himself full of pride and prejudice. As I was writing my book, and as I write in the newspaper, I sometimes find that the best way to improve my own writing is just to get rid of it and replace it with Frederick Douglass quotes. That's what I am doing here. So Rosetta Douglass doesn't actually end up going back to Seward Seminary. Frederick Douglass's children go to a couple of different public schools in the neighborhood, both on Alexander Street and then later on Hamilton Street. And a lot of that decision-making actually was made by not Frederick Douglass, but Anna Murray Douglass, the way that Rosetta says in the sketch that she writes of her mother. It was essentially Anna Murray Douglass who made the decisions about not only where and when they were going to school, but she pulled several of them out of school to work at their dad's newspaper, in essentially like a internship, learning printing trade and all that sort of thing. So this is School 12 on South Avenue. The city has done a really nice job over the last several years, taking this spot that used to be the Douglass homestead and renaming both the library and the school after the family. An important thing to note in this is that Seward Seminary was not a public school, it was a private school. It's not easy to track the question of segregation in private schools, of course, but we do know about one instance of a private school that did allow Black children. It's called the Clover Street Seminary at Clover and Elmwood. It was established in 1845 by a woman named Celestia Bloss, part of a family of abolitionists. One of her teachers was Myrtilla Minor, this woman here, and she later went on to found a school for Black children, Black girls in Washington, D.C., and she reflected that one of the things that set her on the course to do that was that she had worked for a year at Clover Street Seminary, and there were two Black girls there, and it had been a very formative experience for her. So that's evidence of one private school that did allow Black children. So this episode with Rosetta Douglass and Seward Seminary kicks off a period of very intensive interest for Frederick Douglass in the Rochester schools. It also coincides with the publishing of the North Star, which of course is an incredible vehicle for agitating about this. That interest, or I should say the evidence of the interest from Frederick Douglass tapers off after a couple of years. There could be a few reasons for that. One, of course, a lot of his papers were burned and we don't have a complete run of all of them. Second, he certainly had other things on his mind at the time in the 1850s in the United States. And in general, he was more oriented toward the national scene than the local, which is a good thing. So his direct involvement in terms of writing editorials is on the short side. But so every year after this, the school board's debating. Every year there are fewer and fewer Black children, and the parents begin boycotting the Black school. In some instances, they're sending their kids to the white school kind of under the radar. In other instances, not sending them to school at all. And it's becoming the financial burden of opening the school is becoming greater and greater from the school board's perspective. So in 1856, for instance, the superintendent says, the children who attend here could be accommodated in the neighboring schools without any inconvenience except what might arise from prejudice. And experience proves this is not a very serious obstacle, for in most of the schools of the city, there are already more or less colored children, and in some instances, they are among the brightest and most intelligent scholars in our schools. So as the district is thinking about its cost and how it can reduce its cost, it strikes on an ingenious idea, which is to hire a female teacher and pay her and incur, as they say, quote, half the cost and still do equal justice. That is a strategy that has been tried many times over the years, as some of you may know. But they made a mistake in this instance. They hired a woman named Lucy Coleman. She was young then. She had a long life as a social justice advocate. And she later wrote in her memoirs about what happened. I'll read that to you. She said, "I took the situation, determining in my own mind that I would be the last teacher and that the school should die. It died in just 1 year. I persuaded the parents in the different districts to send the more advanced children to the schools in their own districts, suggesting that they always see to it that they went particularly clean and to impress upon the pupil that his or her behavior be faultless as possible. I then advised the trustees of the church to withdraw the permission for any further use of the building, save for church purposes. This is Zion AME Memorial Church was the site of the black school at the time. When the time came for the reopening of the New Year's school, there were neither scholars nor schoolhouse. The death was not violence. No mention was made of the deceased in the papers, and I presume there were not 10 persons in the city that knew, or if they had known, would have cared, that the disgrace was abolished. And that's true largely. The church didn't withdraw permission, but it raised the rent, which from the perspective of the school board was the same thing. So the final denouement in 1856, there's a committee charged with finding a new room for the black school. They come back and they say we couldn't. So it says they are temporarily closing the black school until they can find something new. And that's the end of it. They never find something new, and the black children are dispersed throughout the city. As long as this whole process takes, so from 1832 until 1856, Rochester was actually one of the earliest cities in upstate to integrate its schools. There was an 1873 state law against segregation in public. I'm distracted because I think somebody's drawing on my screen. I have no idea how that's happening, but that's fine. But up until that 1873, there still were black schools running in Buffalo and New York and other cities. So Rochester was really the first major city in New York to get rid of its segregated system. So I talked before about the themes, the importance of regular black parents, including women, along with the leadership from Austin Steward and Thomas James and Frederick Douglass. The other thing we can keep in mind here is hearing a lot of the same refrains from people who are opposed to integrating the schools. They're saying, the leaders are saying, we wish that we could, but the people wouldn't stand for it. There are fears of white people leaving the schools if black children are allowed in. There are fears of intermarriage. At one point, a school board member says, well, we just started letting white girls into the schools. Does anybody really want a black boy sitting right next to them? And these things, unfortunately, you hear well into the 20th century too. So that's the story of desegregation in the Rochester schools in the 19th century, formal desegregation. I do have...
Sorry to interrupt, but we're going to switch interpreters now.
Yeah, good timing.
Thank you.
All right, I have some bonus material here. This is IDB Wells, a very well-known anti-lynching advocate and pioneering black journalist. And she was in Rochester a number of times, including one time in 1895. She was at the First Baptist Church with Susan B. Anthony at a speech. And
Justin, I apologize. I think I just accidentally unshared your screen.
I won't take it personally. Okay. Good? Oh, you unshared my screen.
I was trying to get rid of those annotations and hit the wrong button.
How's this?
You're still on the, there you go. Perfect. Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. So IDB Wells is in Rochester in 1895, and somebody asked a question. So she's talking about lynching and the terrible conditions for black people in the South, and someone says, well, if it's so bad down there, why don't black people come up to the North? Which they hadn't started to do. Of course, that happens. And Susan B. Anthony also answers the question, and she says, well, maybe they're not coming because it's no better here than there. And to support her point, she uses a recent anecdote. She said, School 3, that's the one in the 3rd ward, it had a dance recently. It was 10 cents admission. And a black girl comes in, gives her dime to the teacher. And the teacher says, well, you can go if you want, but if you come, none of the white kids will come and it'll be called off. And Susan B. Anthony says, I consider that the outrage on the feelings of that colored girl was the result of the same spirit that inspired the lynchings of the South. So that makes the news because it was at a meeting with Susan B. Anthony. And the next day, the reporters in the city all go to this teacher's home and ask her what happened. And here's the explanation that she gives to them. She says, I explained the situation to her, the girl, in as kind a manner as possible. I told her that the other pupils, being neighbors and friends, would naturally dance with each other, and that if they did, she would not be able to learn, and consequently would not get the worth of her money. She agreed to what I said and took her seat, smiling and apparently contented. So she said, it's not that you're not allowed to come to the dance, it's just that nobody would ever want to dance with you. And that, she thought, went over pretty well. So that's a rare instance of an insight into the education of Black children in Rochester schools, basically up until the Great Migration in 1950 or so, just because there weren't very many of them and it wasn't a topic of interest to the press. Now, and I'll give you one last bit here, and then I'll open up to questions. I have no idea what time it is. People often ask about Black teachers in schools, and this, as far as I can tell, is the first Black teacher that we ever had in Rochester. Her name's Florence Sprague, and for the Douglass fans, as far as I can tell, she was a niece of Nathan Sprague, who was the husband of Rosetta Douglass. I'm not 100% clear on all the ins and outs of it, but I think that that's the relationship. And she was a teacher at School 24, which is the one at Meggs and Linden Streets in the Highland Park neighborhood. Supply is a substitute teacher, essentially. She apparently was there only for 1 year. So here you see a clipping from 1890. But that, as far as I can tell, qualifies her as the very first Black teacher in Rochester. And then over here you see in 1902, she went and became a secretary for Booker T. Washington at the Tuskegee Institute. She was there for a while. She ended up meeting a doctor who lived in Cairo, Illinois, and they moved there and were very much part of the prominent Black society in Cairo, Illinois. So that's the answer to that. There are a couple more up until like the 1920s. There are maybe 2 or 3 Black teachers in the city, but I believe that Florence Sprague was the first. And so that's my talk. Thanks, everybody. I assume you are still there on the other side of my computer screen, and I'd be glad to take any questions.
At this point, feel free to turn your cameras on and unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question. Brandon and I will also be monitoring the chat bar, so if you prefer to enter your questions in the chat, feel free to do that as well. We also, in the chat, put the link to Justin's article in the Rochester History Journal. So if you're interested in learning more about his research and this topic, please feel free to check that out. We've made it available online for free. Are there questions for Justin? Can you put the link in the chat box? I did, Ted, I did put the link in the chat box already. So if you scroll up in the chat, you should find it Or Brandon, do you have that link that you can pop right in again? That would be great. Oh, Brandon already did. Thank you. All right. Well, if there are no questions, Justin, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who joined us on this beautiful sunny day. We greatly appreciate
I see a hand there from Nora M.
it. Go ahead, Laura.
Actually, I was just doing the little clap emoji because I enjoyed that. Thank you so much.
Oh.
You can do thumbs up, you can clap. That was great.
Thank you.
It's really interesting. I'm a teacher in the city school district, and this is just, it's fascinating.
Oh, good. Well, I'll let you know as I'm working on finishing the entire book at the same time. I hope to have the manuscript done within several months, and then the editing process takes for however long. But one of the things that I'm going to do as it comes out is have a curriculum for students at different grade levels that I'm working on with a teacher preparing, so that we can disseminate. It'll have more to do with the 20th century stuff, but to get it in the hands of as many teachers and students as possible.
That's wonderful. I think that that's really meaningful for kids to do local history, and it's meaningful when applied to the situation in the city school district today to look at segregation and racial issues. I think it's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I've actually had the opportunity to review part of Justin's manuscripts, and one of the things that he is trying to do, and Justin, maybe you can talk more about this, is draw a connection between the long history of segregation and attempts at desegregation and the place where we are today. So that all of this history is very relevant today.
Yeah, that's essentially the reason I wrote the book, of course, or am writing the book. As the education reporter, I'm always getting cornered by people with their theories about what's wrong with the school district, and is it the board or the union or whatever else. And you know, of course, everybody has blame to share in the current situation, but the fact of the matter is that the way the district is constituted would make it almost impossible, even in the best circumstances, to provide something approaching the education that children living just a few miles away do. And that is both the direct result of government policy and things that happened in the years prior to that around housing and school district boundary drawing and things like that. And also a very conscious decision of the school district leadership in the community in the 1960s and 70s not to take steps to make a more equitable system. So that is definitely what I'm driving at with that. I see a question here. Will you be working with the schools in the suburbs as well to make this curriculum available? Yeah, absolutely, for sure. I hope, you know, that's an important thing to always remind people, and I've kept it in mind as I'm writing the book, that when we talk about segregation, maybe like the first thing that comes to people's mind is like, oh, the poor black kids are being segregated away. But segregation, of course, means that everyone is segregated from everyone, and it has different negative consequences for people in every situation. What are some things you would need from suburban districts to collaborate on making this available to teachers? Well, when it's ready, I'm going to make it as easy for them as possible. I'm going to have a curriculum and a book, and I'm going to be free to come and speak with anybody at any time. If there are teachers who are interested in being part of that when it gets going, I'll have a website, and I'll be seeking them out and that sort of thing. This looks like Nahoko, so you know how to contact me. But yeah, I mean, for sure, my hope is to start a conversation in a way that we haven't had in a long time regarding the root causes and effects of segregation, and not think of it as something that's just inevitable. We didn't just wake up and create a segregated city. we built it like this, and we can build it a different way if we want to.
Justin, this is Howard Eagle. Can I ask a couple questions?
Please.
In terms of the curriculum, if you could talk a little bit more about your thinking around that. Is that the idea of what we might call knowledge for knowledge's sake, just so that people know what happened and so forth? Or is there a function? Is the curriculum supposed to help inform us in terms of how we make the changes that you're mentioning? Connected to that, around the question of equity, do you explore at all what I might call practical factors, such as seniority, for example, how seniority as it functions in the school system prevents us from moving toward equity, you know, the kind of last in, first out laws and so forth. And I know that Dr. Urbanski in particular has kind of indicated that we can't change those laws. But if I'm hearing you, that's the kind of thing that you're speaking of changing, precisely. That's just one example.
So to answer your first question, no, I hope it isn't knowledge for knowledge's sake. You know, of course, the way that it gets tailored to young children will be, the result will be separate from, you know, an adult conversation, but it's absolutely intended to make people of every age able to take the knowledge and do something with it. That's the whole point of what I'm doing. To the second question, so let me think how to answer this. So part of my premise is that in the 1960s and 70s, there was a very active discussion about whether, if we assume that Black children are not receiving a fair education, should we integrate them with the white children elsewhere and try to create one equitable system for everyone? Or should we target more resources to those Black children in place and assume that we can fix it without any other changes to the basic social fabric of the country? And unanimously in Rochester and elsewhere in the country, we chose the latter. We said, we're not going to worry about who is there. We're just going to say, whoever happens to be sitting in this classroom, we're going to try and fix things there. And so what I'm saying is, maybe we made the wrong choice, or at least maybe we should rethink the way that we balance those things. So things like, for instance, the union role in teacher seniority, the union role in a lot of things, the development of culturally relevant curriculum. Those are all things that absolutely are important, whether in integrated or the segregated school districts, but they're also kind of sub-factors in a sense of the current constricted view that we have, in my opinion.
Could I explore it a little bit more, unless other people have questions? So as it relates to the choice that we made, right, to try to target resources as things currently exist, as opposed to integration, because that's the other side of the coin. Mm-hmm. How about the fact that, and I have to say this straight, it was massive white flight and white resistance to integration that influenced that choice. I mean, what's different today? Well, I don't see anything fundamentally different now than then. In fact, it seems that in some ways the resistance might be stronger than it was in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. It certainly could be not just massive white flight and resistance, but in many cases active violence against Black children. That's absolutely true.
So then when we talk about re-examining the choice, you know, what does that mean? What is it specifically we're going to re-examine that would make things different in terms of the choice?
Well, I think that most people don't realize that choice was made. I think that the history of what happened not only in the 19th century but later on is mostly lost. So I think that at some point, I think that if we educate people and present a set of options in a different way and think of it in a more equitable way than we did even in the 60s and 70s. You know, at that time it was presented very much as should we or should we not allow Black children the privilege of being in a classroom with white children. And that, of course, is racist in its own sense, even if it was better than what they were talking about in the 19th century. So I think there's evidence of young people, as always, young people are more open-minded about things than those of us the older we get. And my hope is that with the information that I'll compile in the book, we'll give them ammunition with which to make a change. I'll also point out, by the way, that you know, while I believe in integration, I think that that is the direction that we should take personally. The narrative that I write about the way that segregation has happened in Rochester, I think is important for people, no matter what they believe in terms of whether racial integration is an important goal.
All right. Thank you for that, Justin. And thank you, Howard, for starting that discussion for us. Is there anyone else who would like to jump in before we conclude today? Okay. Thank you.
If not, could I ask one more question and I'll stop? Do you treat in your work at all the what I believe is, and I think you agree, the need to deal with institutional and structural racism as it currently exists under the present structure, and not only in terms of urban education, but all of public education, the need to really address racism, the way it functions in the system through curricula, through hiring and firing practices, through so many things, even down to the food that we eat in the cafeteria. Do you treat that at all?
Not at the granular level of that, but that's a theme throughout the book, which I trust that you'll read with interest, is the way that structural institutional racism has played a part in decisions being made going back to 200 years.
Thank you.
Thanks, Howard.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you you spending the time with me here.
And this program has been recorded and we will share that link out. So if you wanted to share it, please look for it on Facebook and the library's page as well. Thank you, Justin. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.